just the Bear Alexander situation as a whole, and we'll get into all it, what I know, what we have been hearing, what happens next, what it means for Georgia going forward. For those of you that have been living under a rock, Bear Alexander at around 1:45 on Saturday afternoon announced that he would be entering the transfer portal. Talking with people in and around the program, the expectation is that this is not going to be like an Amarius Mims situation. The expectation is that he will ultimately end up transferring elsewhere. It sounds like right now USC is the front runner to land Alexander services there. One thing to keep in mind with Bear Alexander and where he ends up going next, it is not going to be an SEC school. He would have to get a waiver to transfer within the SEC, and the expectation is that the SEC would not want to hand out waivers to sort of allow that sort of movement within the conference. And so I think if you're looking for a landing spot with Bear, we mentioned USC as the runaway favorite. Maybe Texas is a name that comes to mind. They had already brought in A.D. Mitchell out of the transfer portal in the January window. And then maybe an Ohio State or Penn State potentially get involved there. But from my understanding, USC is very much the front runner to try and land Bear Alexander services. And if I had to make a prediction right now, that is ultimately where I think he ends up. As far as why this move got made, my understanding is that Bear Alexander was not happy with his playing time and his spot in the Georgia defensive line rotation. I think he wanted to be a clear-cut starter, a guy that, like we saw Jalen Carter play last year, that volume, that level of snaps. And the reality is Georgia just does not employ a defensive lineman that way. Even Jalen Carter had to earn that rep and earn that role over the course of his entire Georgia career. Bear Alexander was entering his second season at Georgia. And while, yes, Bear Alexander has tremendous upside, I think we saw that in the national championship game last season where he had a sack, 2 tackles for loss, showed some real promise in that game there. He's still a young player, still entering his second season. And so I think the important thing to keep in mind there is, look, this Georgia defensive line sort of spinning it forward. It's a veteran-laden group this year. Zion Logue has played a ton of football. Matt Stackhouse and Warren Brinson have played a lot of football for this team. You saw on Saturday, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins is a guy that is coming on, had a really good spring, capped it off with a sack. I think with Bear Alexander transferring out, Christian Miller is now a guy who becomes much more important, and we see him get a sack yesterday. He was similarly to Alexander, though Alexander was higher ranked. Miller was a top 100 defensive lineman in the 2022 recruiting class. So this is a defensive line now that when you look out there and you saw him on G-Day after the dust had initially settled, like, man, they don't have a ton of bodies out there, at least as many bodies as they had in the past. And so you lose Bear Alexander, you lose Jalen Carter to the NFL draft. Michael Williams was not a participant in G-Day as he's dealing with the foot injury. The expectation is for him to be back to 100%. It puts a lot more stress on the early development of Jordan Hall, a guy who by all accounts had a very good spring. Didn't do a whole lot yesterday, but Jordan Hall, 5-star player, a guy that I think Georgia is expecting now to come in and play a rep and a role for this defensive line. He's not going to be the game record that Jalen Carter was, but with Bear Alexander electing to go elsewhere, I think Jordan Hall becomes a much bigger name to know there. And I expect Georgia to try and sign 5 defensive linemen in the 2023 or 2024 rather recruiting cycle, maybe even 6 potentially, because that defensive line is kind of thin right now where they can't afford more than, say, I think 1 or 2 injuries. And then you factor in the fact Zion Logue is a senior, now Stackhouse is a senior, Warren Brinson is a senior. You're going to lose a lot of guys off of this defensive line going into next year. So recruiting that defensive line is going to be vital for Trey Scott. The good news, if you're a Georgia fan, is that Trey Scott has recruited this defensive line incredibly well. He has developed this defensive line incredibly well. And I'm not here to dump on Bear Alexander. Like, he's got a choice and a decision to make. But I don't know how you look at the development of Georgia defensive linemen in recent seasons and decides that this isn't the place for you to want to play college football. They had 3 defensive linemen taken in the first round of last year's draft, all following very different tracks to get to the NFL. Trayvon Walker was a 3 and out. Jordan Davis was a guy that could have been drafted after his junior year, comes back, builds on it, becomes a first-round pick. Devontae Wyatt was a guy I don't think anyone ever anticipated being a first-round pick, and he ends up becoming that going to the Green Bay Packers last year. Even going into this season, Jalen Carter turns out to be, I think, the best draft prospect in the country, at least in terms of what you saw on the football field there. And even with some of the lingering off-field questions and question marks that have surrounded Jalen Carter during this draft process, because of his development at the University of Georgia, there's still a very real world where he's the first non-quarterback taken in this NFL draft. So if you're a defensive lineman and you're saying, I don't want to go to a place that will have produced 4 first-round defensive linemen in the last 2 drafts, that does, to me at least, raise some questions about what necessarily your priorities are. I know a lot of people are going to say NIL was a factor in this. My understanding is that Bear just wanted to play a big role, wanted to be guaranteed a starting spot, and that's just not the culture at the University of Georgia. And Kirby Smart knows that. He understands that. He understands this is just life in college football right now. So we've got him here talking about the transfer portal at large as the window is open starting on Saturday. It'll run through April 30th. Bear Alexander is probably not going to be the last guy from this Georgia team to enter the transfer portal. And that, Bear is obviously the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this. It's going to put a lot of attention on the defensive line and how some of those guys, not necessarily the veterans like Stackhouse, Logue, and Brinson, but some of those guys in the middle tier that we haven't necessarily seen a lot of, Tyrion Ingram-Dawkins, Christian Miller, Jonathan Jefferson there, how those guys develop, because they're now going to be asked to play a role with Bear Alexander entering the transfer portal and very likely playing his next game somewhere else.
Yeah, that's the way of the world. It's who handles it and manages it best, and it's basically the new climate we're in. So the window will open up. All across the country, there'll be guys going in and looking for greener pastures. And that's ultimately the climate that we have created, and it's more power to them. We've got a lot of guys who've benefited from the portal, and I hope we benefit from the portal. We had a couple guys out there today that came by way of the portal that made some really good plays. So it's the climate that we're in, and we'll do the best we can to capitalize on it. But I'm very pleased with what we've got on our team and our roster, and it's not a way that we're going to build a team by any means. Just reps. Christian's gone a long way. He's gotten better. He's really good. Zero knows, and he can stunt and move. He increased his pass rush ability some this offseason and became better. Excited about what he can do, and really excited about the group, the depth in that unit. We don't have a dominant player in that unit, but we've got really good depth, and we'll do some things with the backers around them to create havoc for people.
So you hear Kirby Smart there talking about the defensive line depth, talking about Bear Alexander's situation and why he ultimately enters the transfer portal. We're going to have a ton more on this over the course of the week. I'm sure Brandon Adams is going to have a mouthful to say about this tomorrow, as he did yesterday right after it happened. Got a chance to talk with BA in the press box, and it's rare to see him as riled up and ready to go and ready to talk about a subject as he was yesterday when the Bear Alexander news came out and dropped. So I figure that's going to dominate not just the Georgia landscape, but the college football landscape as a whole as far as what comes next there.